February 1945. The world was on the edge of change, but in the frozen woods of western Germany, time seemed to stand still. The Reichwald forest, once a quiet stretch of trees, had become a graveyard of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The ground was frozen solid, the trees stripped bare, their black branches clawing at a sky the color of gunmetal. Deep inside a ruined German bunker, a scene unfolded that would haunt everyone who heard about it. A Canadian intelligence officer sat across from a captured German officer, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dust and blood. The German's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd been dragged from the wreckage just hours before, pulled out from under the remains of a bunker that had once been considered unbreakable. Now it was nothing but rubble. The Canadian leaned in, asking the question that everyone wanted answered. What happened here? For a long moment, the German officer just stared at the table, his eyes hollow. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. He told a story that sounded almost impossible, a story of survival on the Eastern Front, of facing the Russian guns at Kursk, of living through bombing raids that flattened entire cities. But nothing, he said, nothing in 5 years of war had prepared him for what the Canadian artillery had done in the Reichwald. He called it something worse than hell. Hell, he said, at least had an end. And he wasn't alone. Across dozens of prisoner reports taken during the Rhineland battles, German soldiers and officers repeated the same thing in different words. They had faced the Russians. They had faced the Americans. They had faced the British. But the Canadian guns were different. They were faster, more accurate, and they simply did not stop. One German battalion commander described how, within 4 minutes of his men opening fire, Canadian shells were already landing on their exact position. He couldn't understand how it was possible. He moved his guns twice in one night, and both times, the Canadians found him before dawn. This wasn't just a small skirmish in a forgotten corner of the war. By February 1945, the fighting in Europe was reaching its most violent chapter. The Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, swept across France, and now stood at the very border of Germany. The last great barriers were the Rhineland and the Rhine River beyond it. The Germans knew that if the Allies crossed the Rhine, the war was over. So they fought with everything they had left, packing the Rhineland with troops, guns, and concrete fortifications. They believed their defenses would hold long enough to bleed the Allies dry. But they were wrong. And the reason they were wrong had everything to do with what happened at 5 o'clock in the morning on February 8, 1945. That's when over 1,000 Canadian and British guns opened fire at the same moment along a front just 10 miles wide. The bombardment that morning was one of the heaviest ever fired in the entire war in Western Europe. More than 500,000 shells would fall on the German positions in the days that followed. But it wasn't just the number of shells that broke the German defenders. It was the accuracy. Shells landed exactly where they were aimed, on bunkers, on gun pits, on crossroads, on command posts, with a precision the Germans had never seen from any army on any front in any year of the war. The effect was devastating. Concrete bunkers cracked and collapsed. Communication lines were cut within minutes. German commanders lost contact with their forward units and had no idea what was happening. Soldiers huddled in their shelters as the ground shook without stopping, the vibration so constant and so violent that men could not stand, could not think, could do nothing but press themselves against the shaking walls and wait. Some went mad. Others simply surrendered, stumbling out of the smoke with their hands up, their faces blank, unable to speak. The Canadian artillery had done something no one thought possible. It had broken not just the German defenses, but the German spirit. But here's the real mystery, the question that still stuns military historians today, especially in the United States, where stories of Allied firepower are legendary. How did Canada, a country with almost no army in 1939, become the most feared artillery force in Europe by 1945? How did a nation known more for maple syrup and hockey than for military might create a system so advanced, so precise, that even hardened German veterans called it worse than hell? The answer isn't just about guns or numbers. It's about a revolution in thinking, a story of science, innovation, and relentless determination that would change the course of the war and leave a legacy still felt in every modern army, including America, to this day. But the real secret behind the Canadian guns was just beginning to reveal itself. If you had asked any American general in 1939 about Canada's military, you probably would have gotten a polite smile and a quick change of subject. The United States was building up its own forces, preparing for a world at war, but Canada's army was barely a footnote. The entire regular force numbered fewer than 4,500 men, smaller than the police department of a mid-sized American city. There were almost no modern guns, no tanks, and no real experience with large-scale warfare. In fact, the Canadian military budget had been cut so deeply during the Great Depression that training exercises sometimes used wooden sticks in place of rifles and trucks with cardboard signs that read tank instead of actual armored vehicles. It sounds almost unbelievable, especially to anyone familiar with the massive American war machine that would soon roll across Europe and the Pacific. But in 1939, Canada was a peaceful country of just 11 million people, most of them farmers, workers, and shopkeepers. The idea that this quiet nation could build one of the world's most powerful fighting forces seemed like a joke. Yet within 6 years, Canada would field an army that made even the most battle-hardened German officers tremble. How did this transformation happen? The answer lies in something that no budget cut could destroy: memory. The men who had fought in the First World War were still alive. Many were now farmers, teachers, or factory foremen, but they remembered what they had learned in the mud of France 2 decades earlier. They knew that artillery, not tanks, not machine guns, was the true killer in modern war. They remembered that in the final years of World War I, the Canadian Corps had built something extraordinary, a system of gunnery based not on guesswork, but on science. It was a way of dropping shells on targets with such precision that the enemy never knew the attack was coming, until the sky itself seemed to collapse on top of them. At the heart of this revolution was a man named Andrew McNaughton. In 1939, McNaughton was 52 years old, a thin man with sharp eyes and a mind that moved faster than most people could follow. Before the First World War, he had been an electrical engineer and a professor at McGill University, the kind of man who filled notebooks with equations and thought in numbers. When war broke out, he enlisted as an artillery officer and quickly realized that the guns were being aimed the same way they had been for centuries, by watching where shells landed and shouting corrections back to the gunners. It was slow, it was inaccurate, and worst of all, it gave away every attack before it even started. McNaughton believed there was a better way. He was convinced that if you knew enough about the physics of a shell in flight, about the temperature of the air, the speed of the wind, the wear inside the gun barrel, you could calculate exactly where that shell would land without ever firing a test shot. He called it predicted fire. By 1918, his methods had helped make the Canadian Corps the most feared artillery force on the Western Front. German prisoners spoke of Canadian shells arriving without warning, landing with impossible accuracy, as if guided by some invisible hand. Now 20 years later, McNaughton was back. When war broke out in 1939, he was appointed to command the 1st Canadian Division and later the entire 1st Canadian Army. He carried with him every lesson from the last war: predicted fire, counter-battery work, calibration, meteorology, the mathematics of killing. These ideas had not been forgotten. They had been waiting quietly for the moment when Canada would need them again. But turning memory into reality was no small task. Canada had to build an army from almost nothing, and it had to do it fast. Across the country, men lined up at recruiting stations in numbers that stunned the government. Farmers from Saskatchewan, fishermen from Nova Scotia, factory workers from Ontario, students from McGill and the University of Toronto, all answered the call. Within months, tens of thousands of volunteers were pouring into training camps, that didn't even have enough tents to hold them. The artillery recruits were sent to Petawawa in Ontario, where they learned to operate the 25-pounder gun howitzer, the weapon that would become the backbone of Canadian field artillery for the entire war. The 25-pounder was a British design, tough and reliable, capable of firing a shell weighing just over 24 pounds to a range of about 7.5 miles. A good crew could fire 5 rounds per minute. A great crew could do it even faster. But knowing how to load and fire a gun was only the beginning. The real training was in the math. Canadian artillery officers were taught to calculate firing solutions that accounted for dozens of variables: the temperature of the air and the gunpowder, the weight of each individual shell, the speed and direction of the wind at different heights, the wear inside the gun barrel, even the rotation of the earth itself. All of these numbers had to be gathered, calculated, and applied before every fire mission. It wasn't glamorous work. It was slow, careful, and required the kind of patience that most people would find boring. But it was this invisible, painstaking work that would one day make German soldiers weep with terror. While American forces were building their own legendary artillery units, the Canadians were quietly perfecting a system that would soon shock the world. The transformation from broomsticks and cardboard tanks to a force that could shatter concrete bunkers and break the will of the enemy was underway. And the secret weapon wasn't just steel and explosives. It was the relentless pursuit of precision, the belief that science could win battles, and the memory of lessons learned in blood. But the real test was still to come. The Canadians had the knowledge, the guns, and the men. Now they would have to prove it on the battlefield. In the United States, the story of World War II is often told through the thunder of Sherman tanks, the roar of P-51 Mustangs, and the relentless advance of American infantry. But behind every successful offensive, there was always one thing that made the difference: artillery. The U.S. Army knew it, the Germans feared it, and the Canadians, quietly, methodically, were about to take the science of artillery to a level that would stun even the most seasoned American gunners. The secret wasn't just in the hardware. It was in the minds behind the guns. Andrew McNaughton, the Canadian general and mathematical genius, had already changed the game once in World War I. Now, as the world plunged into another global conflict, he was determined to do it again. McNaughton's vision was simple but revolutionary. Artillery should be a science, not an art. Every shot should be calculated, every variable measured, every shell a promise kept. This was a radical idea in an era when most armies still relied on bracketing, firing a few shells, seeing where they landed, and adjusting aim until they hit the target. It was slow, it was noisy, and it gave away every surprise. But McNaughton believed in something better: predicted fire. If you could measure everything, wind speed, air temperature, humidity, the exact wear inside a gun barrel, the weight of each shell, you could predict exactly where a shell would land without ever firing a test shot. It was math as a weapon, and it would change the face of modern warfare. Canadian artillery schools became laboratories of destruction. Recruits weren't just taught how to load and fire a gun. They were drilled in trigonometry, physics, and meteorology. They learned to read weather balloons, to calculate the effect of wind at different altitudes, to adjust for the tiniest differences in shell weight. They studied the rotation of the earth, the subtle drag of air, the way a cold barrel could change the flight of a shell by a few crucial yards. Every detail mattered, because every mistake could cost lives. The backbone of this new force was the legendary 25-pounder gun howitzer. American artillerymen respected it, German officers dreaded it, and Canadian crews mastered it. The 25-pounder was a marvel of British engineering, tough, reliable, and versatile. It could fire high-explosive shells, smoke rounds, and even armor-piercing projectiles. With a range of over 7 miles and a rate of fire that could reach 6 rounds per minute in skilled hands, it was the perfect tool for the kind of precision warfare McNaughton envisioned. But the real magic happened behind the scenes. Before a single shell was fired, teams of Canadian gunners would gather data, measuring the temperature of the powder, weighing each shell, checking the calibration of every gun. Meteorological teams launched weather balloons to track wind speed and direction at different heights. Surveyors mapped every gun position down to the meter, ensuring that every calculation was as accurate as possible. The result was a level of precision that seemed almost supernatural to those on the receiving end. American observers who visited Canadian artillery units in England were stunned by what they saw. While U.S. crews were excellent, fast, disciplined, and deadly, the Canadians were obsessed with detail. They ran endless drills, setting up their guns in total darkness, calculating fire missions in minutes, hitting targets they couldn't even see. It was a culture of relentless improvement, where every mistake was analyzed, every lesson written down, and every crew pushed to be faster, smarter, and more accurate. This scientific approach paid off in ways that would soon become legendary. When the Canadians finally went into action, their artillery didn't just support the infantry. It led the way, smashing enemy positions with pinpoint accuracy, cutting wire, destroying bunkers, and silencing enemy guns before they could even fire back. German prisoners would later say that it felt like the Canadians could see through the fog, as if every move had been anticipated, every hiding place mapped out in advance. The Americans took notice. U.S. artillery officers began studying Canadian methods, incorporating elements of predicted fire and counter-battery work into their own doctrine. The idea that you could use sound ranging, arrays of microphones to triangulate the position of enemy guns, was quickly adopted by American units. The science of destruction was spreading, and the battlefield was changing. But for the Canadians, it was never about glory. It was about responsibility. Every calculation, every adjustment, every sleepless night spent checking numbers was driven by the knowledge that lives depended on getting it right. The men who stood behind the guns knew that a single mistake could mean disaster for the infantry advancing ahead. They carried that weight with them, every day, through mud, rain, and fire. As the Canadian artillery prepared for its first real test in the crucible of battle, the world was about to witness what happens when science, discipline, and raw determination come together on the front lines. The perfect artillery force was ready. The only question left was whether the enemy could survive what was coming next. And as the guns rolled into position, the answer was about to be written in fire and steel. When American forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the world watched in awe. But months before D-Day, another Allied army was already locked in a brutal campaign that would forge its reputation in blood and fire. The Canadian artillery, built on science and precision, was about to face its first true test, not in the fields of France, but in the unforgiving mountains and villages of Italy. July 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily marked the beginning of a new chapter in World War II. For the Canadians, it was their first taste of real combat since the dark days of Deep. The U.S. Army was pushing hard alongside the British Eighth Army, and the Canadians were right there, landing on rocky beaches under a blazing Mediterranean sun. The terrain was nothing like the rolling fields of home. Instead, it was a nightmare of steep ridges, narrow roads, and ancient stone villages perched on hilltops, each one turned into a fortress by German defenders. The American public remembers the Italian campaign for its relentless grind and staggering casualties. But what most people don't realize is how much the Canadian artillery contributed to breaking the deadlock. In Sicily and southern Italy, the Canadians learned quickly that brute force wasn't enough. The Germans were masters of defense, using every inch of ground to their advantage. Every hill was a strong point, every river crossing a killing ground. The only way forward was through innovation, discipline, and the kind of precision firepower that could turn the tide of battle. It was in the shattered streets of Ortona, a small port town on the Adriatic coast, that the Canadians would earn their place in history. The Germans called it Little Stalingrad. The fighting was house to house, room to room, floor to floor. The Americans had seen urban warfare in places like Aachen and later in the Pacific, but Ortona was a different kind of hell. The Canadians developed a technique called mouse-holing, blasting through the walls of one building to enter the next, avoiding the deadly streets below. It was close-quarters combat at its most savage, where grenades and bayonets mattered more than rifles. But even in this chaos, the Canadian artillery made the difference. Forward observation officers crawled through the rubble with the infantry, radios strapped to their backs, calling in fire on enemy positions just a few hundred yards ahead. The 25-pounders responded with a level of accuracy that seemed impossible. A church steeple hiding a sniper, a basement packed with machine gunners, a crossroads where German reinforcements tried to break through. Each target was destroyed with surgical precision. The margin for error was razor-thin. A shell landing 50 yards short could kill Canadians instead of Germans, but time after time, the gunners delivered. Ortona fell after 8 days of savage fighting, costing the Canadians over 2,000 casualties. But the lesson was clear. Precision artillery could break even the toughest defenses. The Americans took note, studying Canadian techniques and adapting them for their own urban battles in Europe and beyond. The campaign didn't end there. Through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, the Canadians fought their way north through the Italian peninsula. The terrain was some of the worst any army had ever faced, mud, mountains, and rivers that turned into torrents with every rainstorm. The Germans built line after line of fortifications: the Winter Line, the Hitler Line, the Gothic Line. Each one was a maze of concrete bunkers, steel turrets, minefields, and barbed wire. Breaking through required everything the artillery could give. Before the assault on the Hitler Line, Canadian guns unleashed a massive bombardment that lasted for hours. Heavy shells hammered concrete positions, while field guns fired air-burst rounds to cut wire and clear paths for the infantry. When the attack finally went in, the Canadians found gaps in the wire and shattered bunkers, enough to break through, but always at a terrible cost. The Italian campaign was a crucible. The Canadians learned to hit targets hidden behind ridges they couldn't see, to shift fire in seconds when the infantry called for help, to destroy a concrete bunker with 3 rounds when the manual said it should take 10. They learned what their shells did to human beings, and they learned to do it faster and more accurately than anyone else. Every battle was a lesson, every mistake a chance to improve. The gunners wrote everything down, building a playbook of precision and innovation that would soon be the envy of every Allied army. While American forces were fighting their way through France and Belgium, the Canadians in Italy sometimes felt forgotten. They called themselves the D-Day Dodgers, a bitter joke that became a badge of honor, but the fighting they endured was as hard as anything on the Western Front. At the Gothic Line in late 1944, the Canadians faced yet another chain of fortifications, firing their guns in conditions that would have stopped lesser units. Rain turned gun positions into swamps. Mules carried shells up mountain paths too narrow for trucks. Crews worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts beside their weapons, hands cracked and bleeding from handling hundreds of heavy shells in the cold. By the time the Italian campaign wound down and Canadian forces were transferred to Northwest Europe in early 1945, the gunners were hardened veterans. They had fired tens of thousands of rounds in every imaginable condition, from the baking heat of Sicily to the freezing rain of the Apennines. They had learned to trust their math, their training, and each other. They had become a juggernaut, ready to bring everything they had learned to the doorstep of Germany itself. The Americans, always keen students of innovation, watched closely. The lessons of Italy, precision fire, rapid adjustment, relentless discipline, would soon shape the way U.S. artillery fought in the final battles of the war. The Canadian artillery had been forged in the crucible of Italy, and now, as the Allies prepared for the final assault on the German heartland, the world was about to see just how powerful that transformation had been. But the true test, the moment that would define the legacy of Canadian artillery, was still to come. The guns were ready, the enemy was waiting, and the next battle would change everything. By early 1945, the world's eyes were fixed on the final Allied push into Nazi Germany. American forces were surging across France, the Soviets were closing in from the east, and the fate of Europe hung in the balance. But in the frozen forests of Western Germany, a different kind of storm was about to break, one that would redefine the power of Allied artillery and leave even the most battle-hardened U.S. commanders in awe. The operation was called Veritable. Its objective, to smash through the last great German defensive lines in the Rhineland and open the road to the Rhine River, the final barrier before the heart of Hitler's empire. The Canadian First Army, fighting alongside British units, was given the lead role. American generals watched closely, knowing that success here would shape the entire Western Front. At precisely 5:00 a.m. on February 8, 1945, the sky over the Reichwald forest erupted. More than 1,000 Canadian and British guns fired in perfect unison, unleashing a bombardment so intense that men standing miles behind the lines felt the ground tremble beneath their boots. The night was torn open by the flash of artillery, turning darkness into a flickering orange dawn that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the first 24 hours alone, over 500,000 shells rained down on German positions, an average of 6 shells every second, hour after hour, without pause. To American observers, the scale was staggering. But what truly set the Canadian artillery apart wasn't just the volume, it was the accuracy. Every battery had been individually calibrated. Meteorological teams launched weather balloons in the hours before the attack, measuring wind speed, direction, and temperature at different heights. Survey teams mapped every gun position down to the meter. The math was done, the data was perfect, and when those shells left their barrels, they didn't fly blind, they flew with purpose. The effect on the German defenders was immediate and devastating. Concrete bunkers, built to withstand heavy shelling, cracked and collapsed under the relentless pounding. Communication lines were cut within minutes, leaving German commanders isolated and blind. Soldiers huddled in their shelters as the earth shook without stopping, the vibration so constant and violent that men could not stand, could not think, could do nothing but press themselves against the shaking walls and pray for it to end. Some went mad. Others simply surrendered, stumbling out of the smoke with their hands up, their faces blank, unable to speak. The Canadian artillery had done what few thought possible. It had broken not just the German defenses, but the German spirit. American intelligence officers, reading the reports, were stunned by the psychological impact. German prisoners described the bombardment as something worse than hell. One battalion commander said that within 4 minutes of opening fire, Canadian shells were already landing on his exact position. He moved his guns twice in one night, but both times, the Canadians found him before dawn. But the real genius of Operation Veritable was in the coordination. The creeping barrage, a wall of explosions rolling forward at a fixed rate, allowed Canadian infantry to advance just behind the shellfire, close enough that the Germans were still in their bunkers when the attackers arrived. The margin for error was razor-thin. A man who moved too fast could be killed by his own guns. But the Canadians trusted the math, trusted their gunners, and walked through the smoke and chaos with a confidence that stunned even their allies. Behind the front lines, the counter-battery war raged. German artillery tried to fire back, desperate to break up the Canadian advance. But every time a German battery fired, Canadian sound-dranging teams sprang into action. Microphones positioned along the front picked up the blast, and within minutes, the coordinates were calculated and relayed to waiting Canadian guns. The reply was swift and deadly. Some German batteries were destroyed before they could fire a fourth round. Others simply stopped shooting, their crews abandoning their guns and fleeing into the forest. American artillery officers, already respected for their own firepower, took notice. The speed and precision of the Canadian counter-battery system became the new gold standard. U.S. units began adopting similar techniques, using sound ranging and flash spotting to hunt down enemy guns with unprecedented speed. The science of predicted fire, perfected in Canadian hands, was now shaping the way the entire Allied force fought. But the cost was high. The fighting in the Reichwald was brutal. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud, bogging down tanks and supply trucks. The infantry fought through tangled woods and shattered bunkers, often at close quarters. Over the course of Operation Veritable and the follow-up battles that cleared the Rhineland, the Canadian First Army suffered nearly 16,000 casualties. But they broke through. The Siegfried Line, which the Germans believed would hold for months, fell in weeks. The Rhine lay open, and the road to victory was clear. In the aftermath, American and British commanders alike recognized what had happened. The Canadian artillery had not only shattered German defenses, it had changed the very nature of the battlefield. German officers, captured and interrogated, spoke of the bombardment the way men speak of natural disasters, something beyond human control, beyond endurance. One colonel, a veteran of the Eastern Front, said the Russian guns were terrible but crude. The Canadian guns, he said, found you. They knew where you were, and once they knew, there was no escape. The lessons of Operation Veritable would echo across the U.S. Army and the entire Allied command. Precision, coordination, and relentless innovation had turned the Canadian artillery into a force that could break even the strongest enemy. And as the Allies prepared for the final push into Germany, every American soldier knew that the guns behind them, whether Canadian, British, or U.S., were now more powerful, more accurate, and more unstoppable than ever before. But the story of the Canadian guns wasn't just about steel and fire. It was about the men who served them, the sacrifices they made, and the legacy they left behind, a legacy that would shape the future of warfare on both sides of the Atlantic. And as the smoke cleared over the Rhineland, the world would never look at artillery the same way again. Behind every thunderous artillery barrage, behind every shattered bunker and every mile of liberated ground, there are stories, stories of men who lived through the unimaginable, and of those who never made it home. For American audiences, the tales of heroism and sacrifice on the front lines are familiar, but the human cost of the artillery war in the Rhineland reveals a side of World War II that's often overlooked, even in the most detailed U.S. military histories. The Canadian gunners who unleashed the storm at the Reichwald were not faceless machines. They were young men from farms, cities, and small towns, many not so different from the American GIs fighting in the Ardennes or crossing the Rhine. Their days and nights blurred together in a relentless cycle of loading, firing, and calculating, their hands blistered and burned from handling red-hot shell casings. The physical toll was staggering. A single 25-pounder crew might handle over 500 shells in a day, more than 5,000 pounds of steel and explosives, lifted and loaded in freezing mud and darkness. But the worst damage was often invisible. The noise was so constant and overwhelming that many gunners suffered permanent hearing loss, a fate shared by countless American artillerymen from Normandy to Okinawa. The blast wave from a 25-pounder could rupture eardrums even with cotton stuffed in their ears. By the end of a bombardment, men moved like old men, their shoulders hunched, their arms heavy, their ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that would never fully fade. Yet in the midst of this chaos, moments of humanity shone through. Canadian infantry advancing through the forest found German soldiers wandering alone among the shattered trees, their weapons abandoned, their hands open and empty. These were not men surrendering in the traditional sense. They were men who had simply stopped being soldiers. The Canadians gave them water, cigarettes, and led them gently to the rear. One medic wrote home about treating a young German, no more than 17, who had been buried alive when his bunker collapsed. The boy could not stop shaking, repeating a single word over and over, a word that meant enough. On the other side, the German experience was one of terror and disbelief. Diaries and letters recovered from the battlefield paint a picture of psychological collapse. One entry, found in the pocket of a dead soldier, simply read that he could not take it anymore, that the shelling had gone on for 3 days, that he hadn't eaten or slept, and that he wished it would end one way or another. Another diary, kept by a company commander, tracked his losses hour by hour. In 48 hours of Canadian bombardment, he lost his entire headquarters staff, 3 of 4 platoon leaders, both field telephones, and his will to continue fighting. His last entry said he was ordering his men to surrender at the first opportunity. The counter-battery war was a deadly chess match. German artillery crews knew that firing their guns was like painting a target on themselves. Canadian sound-dranging teams, using arrays of microphones and advanced math, could pinpoint the source of enemy fire within minutes. The reply was swift and merciless. Some German batteries were destroyed before they could fire a 4th round. Others simply abandoned their guns, fleeing into the woods rather than wait for the inevitable reply. American artillery officers, already respected for their own counter-battery skills, studied these Canadian methods and quickly adopted them, knowing that survival on the modern battlefield depended on speed, precision, and innovation. But the cost was not one-sided. Not every Canadian gunner survived the Rhineland. Gunner James Chicken, just 22 years old, was killed on March 1, 1945 during a counter-battery exchange. His last letter home asked his mother to save some apple pie for him because he planned to eat an entire one when he got home. He never made it back. His grave, marked by a simple white stone and a maple leaf, stands among thousands of others in the Netherlands, a silent testament to the price of victory. For those who did survive, the scars lasted a lifetime. Sergeant Robert Fraser, a gun layer who fired thousands of rounds during the campaign, was left nearly deaf by the end of the war. But it wasn't just the hearing loss. For years, he flinched at the sound of thunder or a car backfiring. Every anniversary of the battle, he would sit alone in his garage, lost in memories he never shared. His story echoes those of countless American veterans, whose wounds, physical and invisible, followed them home and shaped the rest of their lives. The human cost of the artillery war in the Rhineland was staggering, and it was paid by men on both sides, by Canadians who trusted their math and their training, by Germans who faced a storm they could not escape, and by families who waited for news that sometimes never came. The legacy of their sacrifice is written not just in history books, but in the quiet cemeteries and the memories that refuse to fade. But as the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, the impact of the Canadian artillery would ripple far beyond the battlefield, changing the course of the war and shaping the future of military science for generations to come. The thunder of Canadian artillery in the Rhineland didn't just shatter German defenses, it sent shockwaves across the entire Allied command. For American military strategists, the lessons of Operation Veritable were impossible to ignore. The precision, speed, and relentless innovation of the Canadian gunners had changed the rules of the game, and the ripple effect would be felt from the front lines of Europe to the war rooms of Washington, D.C. As the dust settled over the Reichwald, Allied commanders realized that the Canadian First Army had accomplished something extraordinary. The Rhineland, once considered an impenetrable fortress, had fallen in weeks, not months. The Siegfried Line, a symbol of Nazi strength, was now a memory. The Rhine River, the last great barrier to the heart of Germany, lay open. American generals, always searching for the edge that would save lives and speed victory, took note. The Canadian artillery's success wasn't just about brute force. It was about a new way of thinking, one that valued science, coordination, and adaptability above all else. The numbers told part of the story. During the Rhineland campaign alone, Canadian artillery fired over 2 million shells, enough to fill a freight train stretching for miles. But unlike the massive, often inaccurate barrages of earlier years, these shells landed exactly where they were aimed. The predicted fire system, perfected by Canadian gunners, meant that every round was a calculated strike, not a random explosion. This level of precision was a revelation to American officers, who quickly began incorporating similar methods into their own artillery doctrine. The impact went far beyond the battlefield. German intelligence assessments, captured after the war, consistently identified the Canadian First Army as the most dangerous Allied formation in the North, and its artillery as the primary reason. When German units learned that Canadians had moved into their sector, morale plummeted. Officers reported spikes in desertion rates. Soldiers who had held their ground against other Allied forces began surrendering in large numbers when they realized it was the Canadians in front of them. The psychological effect was so profound that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, was forced to shift reserves northward to face the Canadian threat, weakening his defenses elsewhere and giving American forces to the south a crucial advantage. This ripple effect shaped the entire Western Front. As the Canadians broke through the Rhineland, American armies found less resistance in their own sectors. The German command, stretched thin and reeling from the relentless Canadian bombardment, could no longer hold the line. The door to Germany was open, and the final phase of the war in the West began in earnest. Cities fell, armies surrendered, and the end of the conflict came faster than anyone had dared hope. But the influence of the Canadian artillery didn't stop with the fall of the Third Reich. American and British artillery officers studied Canadian methods in detail, eager to adopt the innovations that had proven so effective. Sound ranging, flash spotting, and the mathematics of predicted fire became standard practice in U.S. artillery schools. The idea that every shell should be a precision weapon, calculated to land on target with the first shot, became a guiding principle for generations of American gunners. The ripple effect extended into the Cold War and beyond. As the U.S. military prepared for new conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, the lessons of the Rhineland campaign remained at the core of American artillery doctrine. The relentless pursuit of accuracy, the integration of science and technology, and the commitment to saving lives through precision firepower. All of these became hallmarks of the U.S. Army's approach to modern warfare. The Canadian artillery's legacy was more than just a chapter in history. It was a turning point. It proved that innovation and discipline could overcome even the most formidable defenses. It showed that the right combination of brains and bravery could change the course of a war. And it reminded every American soldier, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam, that the future belongs to those who adapt, who learn, and who never stop pushing the boundaries of what's possible. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and marched toward victory, the world saw the power of precision unleashed. The ripple effect of the Canadian guns would echo through every battle that followed, shaping the destiny of nations and the future of warfare itself. But even as the war drew to a close, the story of the Canadian artillery was far from over. Its legacy would live on, in the memories of those who served, in the doctrines of armies around the world, and in the quiet cemeteries where the cost of victory is written in stone. And as the world rebuilt from the ashes, the lessons of the Rhineland would remain, a testament to the power of innovation, the price of freedom, and the enduring impact of those who dared to change the game. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world was forever changed. For American families, the end of World War II meant homecomings, celebrations, and the hope of peace. But in the quiet aftermath, the true legacy of the Canadian artillery, its precision, its innovation, and its human cost, continued to ripple across continents and generations, shaping the very future of modern warfare. The cemeteries of Europe tell part of the story. In the Netherlands, not far from where the Reichwald fighting raged, rows of white stones stretch across green fields. Each one marks a life cut short, a son, a brother, a friend. For American visitors, these places are a powerful reminder that victory was never just about strategy or firepower. It was about sacrifice, shared by allies from every corner of the world. The Canadian graves stand alongside those of Americans and British, silent witnesses to a partnership that changed history. But the land itself remembers. The forests of the Rhineland have grown back, but the scars remain: uneven ground, crumbling bunkers, and trees all the same age, planted after the old ones were destroyed by shellfire. For those who walk these woods today, the echoes of the past are never far away. The legacy of the Canadian artillery is written not just in stone, but in the very earth where freedom was won. For the United States, the lessons of the Canadian guns became part of the DNA of the modern military. The science of predicted fire, pioneered by Canadian innovators like Andrew McNaughton, became standard practice in American artillery schools. The use of sound dranging, flash spotting, and meteorological data, once cutting-edge secrets, are now everyday tools for U.S. gunners from Fort Sill to forward bases around the world. Every time an American artillery battery calculates a fire mission with pinpoint accuracy, they are drawing on a legacy forged in the mud and chaos of the Rhineland. But the impact goes deeper than tactics and technology. The Canadian experience proved that a nation's strength isn't measured by its size, but by its willingness to learn, adapt, and push the boundaries of what's possible. In the years after the war, Canada emerged as a respected power on the world stage, its voice heard in the halls of the United Nations and NATO. For American leaders, the Canadian example was a reminder that innovation and partnership could achieve what brute force alone never could. The human side of the story endures as well. Veterans returned home carrying memories that would last a lifetime, some too painful to share, others passed down as lessons for future generations. American and Canadian families alike learned that the price of precision was paid not just in steel and fire, but in sleepless nights, empty chairs at the dinner table, and the quiet strength of those who carried on. The obsession with accuracy wasn't about pride or competition. It was about saving lives, about making every shot count, about honoring the trust of the men who walked behind the barrage. Today, the legacy of the Canadian artillery lives on in every modern conflict where precision matters more than ever. From the deserts of the Middle East to the mountains of Afghanistan, American and Allied gunners rely on the principles first perfected in the forests of Europe. The mathematics of wind and temperature, the relentless pursuit of accuracy, the belief that science and discipline can tip the scales of war, all of these are part of a shared heritage that continues to shape the future. But perhaps the most important lesson is the one that can't be measured in numbers or medals. It's the understanding that every decision, every calculation, every shell fired carries a weight that endures long after the battle is over. The men who built and served the Canadian guns knew that mistakes in war are paid for in blood. Their obsession with getting it right was a tribute to the lives that depended on them, a lesson that resonates with every American soldier, past and present. As the sun sets over the quiet cemeteries and the forests grow tall once more, the echoes of precision still roll across the years. The guns are silent, but their legacy endures, in the doctrines of armies, in the memories of families, and in the freedom secured by those who dared to demand more from themselves and their nation. The story of the Canadian artillery is more than a chapter in history. It's a reminder that innovation, partnership, and the relentless pursuit of excellence can change the world. For the United States and its allies, it's a legacy worth remembering and a standard worth striving for every single day.